that. So if you're here at the beginning, right before we start, we play a video all the time. We play this video, and at the end of it, it says things like, we make mistakes. We're not perfect, but this is His church. So if you're here, I know we play it every week, so if you're here, I think we've kind of gotten a habit of not listening to it, not thinking about it. We kind of finish up our conversations. But I encourage you next week, if you're here before we start, or as we're starting and it's playing, to really stop and listen to it for a moment. Because it's a wonderful declaration of what Christianity is, and how we should be as Christians. Recognizing our failures, recognizing we're not perfect, recognizing we try to do better, but in all of it, it's not our church, it's not on our works, it's not on who we are, but it's on God, and it's what He can do, and it's what He is doing. So it's just powerful, and I encourage you to just think about that. Think about that throughout the week. Just remind yourself, it's not about us. It's not about us being perfect. It's not about any of that. It's about God. It's about Jesus. And I wanted to encourage that real quickly right now before we do anything else this morning. And just include that in your prayer life. Include that in your conversation with God. And I want to say something about the prayer life as we're saying and we're singing those songs and stuff. Your prayer life doesn't have to be something big and scary. I say that sometimes because I think quite often we kind of think about prayer and like, I shouldn't pray. I don't pray enough. I should pray more. And it turns into kind of some big burden, or how do I pray more? How do I do it? And you kind of start creating all these, I got to do it this way. I got to carve out this time here so I can actually pray. Those type of prayer times are amazing. If you have the ability or the schedule to carve out a chunk of time to really set aside that you can pray and just be focused only on that, that's amazing. But your prayer life can be so much more fluid than that. Please be aware of that. It can be just simple 2-sentence conversations with God throughout the day, all the time. A thought comes across your mind, and you just say, basically, what about this, God? What should I think about this? And sometimes you can just leave it at that. And then that gives time for God to speak back and to show something and to guide you. But the prayer life should be something that we're doing throughout the day as a conversation. I mean, yes, you can look up great Christians, so to speak, of the past, famous people who are preachers and stuff, and some of them will have started their days with 3-hour prayer sessions. There are people like that. But I can guarantee you that isn't the only time they prayed throughout the day. It was a constant conversation in between them and God. And so I just want to encourage you in your prayer life, as we're asking to see God move, as we're asking what He's doing, just make it a conversation throughout the day. And it kind of takes off the burden of making this special time and this special stuff, and it gets us into conversation. And if you get into conversation with someone, if you can start it and you get to know that person, as friendships develop just with humanity, it's amazing how much easier and longer conversations get. And that's how prayer will be. If you start with those little statements here and there, those little thoughts, if you think God is saying something, just thinking about it in a mindful set, those conversations will grow and they'll get bigger with your God. And you'll be able to have an amazing, powerful prayer life. So I encourage that this morning. All right. Sorry, I got to kind of shift gears now. I do have one announcement that I want to stress, and if there should be a slide here. Members meeting next Sunday after church. There'll be a little break for people who aren't sticking around or need to leave, and the plan is to figure out some food here, something to snack on so everyone isn't starving or dying. Now, this is called a members meeting, but that does not mean that only members get to come. This is a meeting that is kind of about membership. We typically sign membership, make some kind of agreement to be members for the new year. That's how we've operated always, that every year we recommit to the congregation, we recommit to the people in our community, our little thing with one another. So that's what this meeting is about. This meeting is about to talk about our church, to kind of talk about where we're going, talking about some of the stuff that just we don't do on Sunday mornings up here, to kind of talk and share that kind of stuff and commit and look at different stuff like that. So this is, even if you're not sure about membership, even if you don't want to be a member, it's a good thing to come and sit through and just listen and kind of find out who we are, and we can share a little bit differently. So it's not you can only come if you're a member. This is to come to find out, and you can leave and maybe you'll think, well, that wasn't super important to me to go for, and maybe you'll learn something about who we are, what we're doing, what we're seeing, what we're going for. And so I encourage you, if you have the time, the ability, and if you really don't have the time or the ability next week to be here and you're still curious, catch up with me afterwards and I'll try to recap it all or talk to you, explain things and stuff like that. But this is a fairly good, important thing to try to make it to, so I encourage you to do so. So that's the only thing I'm going to do for announcements this morning, to try to help that sink in, set in. So there we go. All right, to the sermon. Sorry, I'm going to try to, hopefully my voice holds it together. Last night I did a little bit more of an extended time in the cold at work than I'm normally do, and so it's kind of a little bit rougher this morning, which, if you don't know, I work in a fridge, so if anyone's curious. And so sometimes, by the end of the night, my throat can be a little drained, and so sometimes Sunday morning getting up here and speaking is a bit of a challenge. So I'll try to hold it all together, and I was last night, it was 10 o'clock at night, and I was like, I might be losing my voice. That won't be good for preaching. So, thankfully, it did not actually disappear. I guess I don't need that open. So, all right. This series, A Renewed Look. So this series is probably one of the longest series I've ever done collectively. But we started this at the new year, A Renewed Look. It seems like New Year's was a long time ago already, doesn't it? At least it does to me. It says the life is so busy, there's so much going on. The beginning of January, the beginning of 2022 seems like forever ago. But that forever ago, which is, 6 weeks ago, about six weeks of 7 Sundays because we canceled the one, really wasn't that long ago. And as every New Year's, we kind of reevaluate, at least most people, a lot of people, to kind of reevaluate, think of what do we want to accomplish here, that kind of stuff. And that's what this series has been for the church. I've been re-looking at, pulling up some of these things that we maybe know in our faith, we've read about, we've talked about, but just kind of trying to take another new look at some of these things. And we've been going along through this series. And there's something I want to say about preaching and sermons here, and I think it bears on this topic. So I would guess that everyone's thought about it once in a while, but not a lot of thought into it regularly, on how pastors choose sermons and sermon topics and how they build their sermons. And so I'm not going into this deep thing about it. And so there's some different styles with it, different ways. Maybe it's a large church with a lot of staff and they sit down and pray and they kind of build themes or topics throughout the year and try to plan strategically topics or a series or choose things. But then the actual sermons come down to the week or weeks ahead, starting to work and read and pray. But where I'm going with this is the majority of sermons, or hopefully the majority of pastors, or hopefully all pastors, are not up front on Sunday mornings preaching sermons because they just like to hear their own voice. I am not up here this morning because when I'm really tired or stuff like that, I want to get up and just make sure everybody's listening to Theo. It's not that at all. I am truly up here and I believe most pastors are getting up and they're doing sermon prep and that kind of stuff, is because they feel that in their conversation with God, they're being led by God. We're working through material, and there's truly stuff in these sermons that we think will edify and encourage and build up people if they are willing to come and listen. That is the reason for sermons. It's not like pastors, like there's some 2,000-year tradition that we got to check that box to make sure we're a good pastor. I mean, yeah, you're a good pastor if you're preaching good sermons. That's going to help be a good pastor. But the real reason that's a good pastor thing is because the idea is to build up, edify, and encourage. So when I preach these sermons, through this series, if there's been a topic you're like, I know that, I encourage you to really dig in and listen. Because I'm preaching it because I believe there's something in there for everybody. Some little nugget somewhere. Even if you've been in church for 60 years or 30 years or 2 years, God has a way of revealing himself. And so I am encouraging you. And so one of the reasons I'm encouraging that is because longer series, sometimes people can check out a little bit, or certain topics they can. And so I'm going to read this opening verse again, which I've read every week at the beginning of this series. So sometimes they're like, oh, that one again. But I really want you to listen and think about it. See if you can find something different in here. 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 15. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building on it. Each builder must choose with care how to build on it. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. That foundation is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone holds on the foundation, or builds on the foundation, with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, the work of each builder will become visible. For the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each has done. If what has been built on the foundation survives, the builder will receive a reward. If the work is burned up, the builder will suffer loss. The builder will be saved, but only as through fire. Only as through fire. So I've broken this down a little bit week after week. I've done that kind of stuff. But I read it this week, and I just asked myself this question. What have I built? What have I built? And maybe you've picked something else out of that in there, you're thinking about it, but if you didn't catch anything, I encourage you to ask that question of yourself. What have I built? Obviously regarding to your faith and what you have done with the message of Jesus Christ. The mercies, the grace that has come from God in the name of Jesus Christ. What have I built on that foundation? What do I know? What have I done? How do I behave? What have I built? And that's just the question I wanted to ask real brief off of that verse this morning. So this series, we've talked about that, building. We've talked about the Holy Spirit, living in the Spirit, the works of the flesh, or the fruit of the Spirit. If we're living in Jesus, we're building stuff. We should have fruit. We've talked about one of those fruits is love. We've talked about a bunch of different things. Last week we talked about the church, the body, being committed, being around one another. Some of these, if you haven't heard them, I encourage you to go to our YouTube and find them, maybe listen to them. If you have some time in the background or something, kind of get this thought coming together. And so we've talked about all these different things, and when I was coming to this topic that I felt that I needed to talk about, I was trying to figure out good ways to transition and go everything in there. And the word is treasures that I titled this. Treasures. Because I was thinking about this, and you know what? A really good way to get people to shut down, ignore, not listen, is to bring up the words of people giving money to something. Tithing, taxes, giving. I mean, think about it. If you go to, let's say, your work, and the bosses call a meeting together, and everyone comes together, and the bosses say, "Oh, you're all getting a $2,000 bonus," there's a lot of excitement. But if they all said, "Due to situations with some new regulation, we now are going to require you to chip in 10% of your gear costs," everyone's not going to be paying attention. It's going to shut down. And that is quite often how it is in churches, in sermons, in Bible, anything. You start talking about money, and there is an immediate disconnect, shutdown. There's something like we don't want to hear it, we don't want to deal with it. I mean, overall, think about it this way: the amount of time money gets discussed in the Bible compared to the amount of time that pastors talk about it, there's a big difference. There's a big difference. And part of the reason I believe that is, and I don't have like all sorts of studies to show this, but you could read it, you could research this, is especially now in America and in Western civilization, and it's spreading everywhere, we have been programmed to consume. We are consumers. Gratification, me, I get what I want, consume. One of the ways you can see that this is very true when I'm saying you talk about money, talk about tithing, talk about giving, a good way to get people to get excited is to use catchy words like save, deal, buy one, get one, free, good returns on financial investments. You watch TV, you're going to see commercials, and those words are going to be tied into like everything. From cell phone plans to banking plans to financial investments to cars, those words are catchy to us because we've been programmed to consume and not to be on the other side of it. And so it carries into church. That carries into church. And so this morning, I don't actually want to exactly talk about tithing, but I want to talk about this topic of money and really the term treasures, henceforth why it's called treasures. This morning we're going to go through the Bible, or really just the New Testament, and we're going to look at some verses. I want to point some different things out, and I'm not going to read a single verse this morning that says anything the word tithe or tithing or about a required set amount of money. I mean, you can go to the Old Testament. I'm going to have to ask you to trust me. Hopefully you do. That we could go through the Old Testament, and there's all sorts of regulations in the law of what percentages and amounts that people are supposed to bring in from everything. And it's not just money to fruit to time. There's all different kind of stuff. But we're going to read some passages in the New Testament, and we're going to take little quick looks at some of these things to try to get a good picture of the dialogue of Jesus when it comes to money. And some of the topics, the passages won't even see that much to do with money, but it's in there. So we're going to read through a few of these. I'm going to kind of try to break a few down, and collectively they're going to come together to create a thought and a theme about the treasures. That's at least where I hope this pieces together that way, that we can all come to this kind of understanding. So the first one we're going to read is in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, and then 24. So this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, one of Jesus' most complete big chunk of recorded sermon giving. So here he goes, right in the middle of this. Do not store up treasures on earth for yourself do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Skipping down a few verses. No one can serve two masters. For a slave will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. you cannot serve God and wealth. It's an interesting little passage there, but really kind of introduces this thought of Jesus introducing this topic of treasures. Treasures. Do not store up treasures on earth. Now, through talking through this, reading these passages as we read them this morning, I want to point out there's also a number of scriptures that are in the Bible, in the wisdom in the Old Testament, that talk about, counting the cost of something before you start, and making sure you're, storing up for the winter so you don't starve, things like that. Like even the grasshoppers, the squirrels, there's certain level of, I'm not talking about necessarily straight up like putting yourself into poverty constantly. That's not what I'm talking about. This morning, we're kind of talking about the heart of our heart in how we view treasures. And that is the majority of the dialogue of Jesus through this. So he's saying, don't store up for yourself treasures on earth. So in his time, just like today in every other era of history, there are the super wealthy people and the super poor people. And it's always easy for one group to say the other group has more than they need, or the other group to say, well, I've got this because I've worked this, or I got this, it's my right. And there's just always been this issue with money. As long as money and wealth and treasures have existed, it has been an issue for mankind. I just want to say it's not something new. And so when he's saying store up treasures, there's many ways we could store up treasures. I mean, there could be a small fishing town in Galilee that their big houses are like small little structures compared to the mansions in Rome. I mean, it's not a comparative thing necessarily. He's talking about what you're doing, how you're storing up treasures. Now, when I read these things, I'm also not saying that it may be wise to store up a little bit of savings so that way if you have a medical accident in our modern society, you can pay your bill as you've received services, because I think that's also appropriate. But he's talking about storing up these treasures like they're the things that are going to sustain you. And we'll see that topic throughout here. And he throws out that last little verse we jumped down to in verse 24 there. It says, you cannot serve two masters. You're going to love one or hate the other. You can't serve God and money. Now, I was thinking about some ways to try to give an analogy to this, about storing up treasures and everything, or you can't love two people. You look at children and how they interact with their parents. Now, most children, if they're the happy, healthy family scenario, love both their parents. But kids are really intuitive to typically try to learn what they can get from which parent. And if they don't get something from one parent, they try to shift gears and get something from the other parent. Or if you were in a workplace and you happen to have two managers of equal authority, typically you're going to find out almost everyone in your crew prefers one or the other more than the other one. And they get a little disappointed if one has the weekend off or the day off, or because then they're going to have to work with the other manager. It's just we kind of naturally pick favorites. It's because we're kind of programmed, not kind of, we are. God created us to have this relationship with Him, to be basically in worship and with something. And so when that is not God, it becomes something else, which typically, because we're humans, it connects to money and treasures a lot. Treasures. Now, obviously, currency and stuff is different in different countries, different eras, so the word treasures works really well. Some people might not have a lot of cash on hand, but have 24 cars. Treasures. Treasures, that's the wealth, our possessions. It says, do not store up on earth, for where your treasures is, your heart will be. So store treasures in heaven. Now I want to stress something that Jesus said in there. There's two words in there that are very powerful. He says, no one. No one. We kind of, I think, have this innate thought that, like, well, I can. Most people can't have wealth and treasures and be super dedicated to this and be dedicated to God, but I'm going to be able to, because I'm going to use my treasures. Somehow they're going to bless my ministry and stuff like that. And Jesus is just flat out saying, what you treasure will be the number one thing in your heart. He does not say that there cannot be rich Christians, wealthy Christians, someone with a lot of possessions that are truly dedicated to God. But what he is saying is those aren't that person's treasures. Their treasures are, your treasure is either going to be God and your relationship with God or something else. No one can treasure two things equally. That's what he's saying in there. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. So we're going to continue this thought a little bit, and we're going to jump to Matthew chapter 19, verses 16 through 23. Then someone came to him and said, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And he said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." And he said to him, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. Also you should love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "I have kept these. What do I still lack?" Jesus said to him, "If you wish to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasures in heaven. Then come follow me." When the young man heard this word, he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "Truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven." So this passage, and I have used it this way, really is about the heart. Not really about riches, not about tithing, not so much about money, but about the heart. And that's why it's super important to this topic of treasures. Jesus even throws in the word treasures in heaven in that conversation. So this guy comes up, typically kind of thought as a rich young person. He comes up to Jesus, says, "Teacher," or "Good teacher." So he's coming in, giving some respect to Jesus. What must I do to have eternal life? What must I do? And so, culturally, and I think we still do this a bit, especially in their time, culturally, people who were rich in the kind of the Old Testament and through the change of the Old Testament to Jesus' time, if you were rich, that must mean God is blessing you. That must mean you're doing everything right, kind of to the idea of the Old Testament law being a little twisted by the scribes and the Pharisees. So when it says this rich young ruler's coming up, there's kind of an air of, I've got it all good with God, and I want you to make sure, just double check, show me if there's anything left, because I think I deserve eternal life. I think I deserve the right to be considered a good person of God. So he's coming to ask this question. And this is essentially the question he's asking. There should be a slide here, I believe, or two. This man wanted to know how to be saved, and Jesus talked about money. I want you to sink in for a second. So quite often people, when they come and talk to us about how to be saved, we go into how they get saved, and Jesus didn't. This guy's coming and asking about eternal life. And Jesus goes, basically, let's talk about money. Which I think shows how important this topic needs to be in churches. How important this topic needs to be for Christians. Now, he uses the word treasures and wealth, rich, that kind of stuff. But Jesus is telling this man, oh, if you're following these rules, if you're doing this kind of stuff, then this is my commandment for you. Young man, whatever his name is, we could call him Tom, I don't know. We can imagine whatever name we want in there. Go and give your riches away. That's what he says. Go and give away your possessions. Sell what you have. And then come follow me. He says, if you go sell your stuff and give it to the poor, you're going to have treasures in heaven, which is what we read in the previous thing, that we should try to store up treasures in heaven. And then he tells them, then you can come follow me. Jesus saying, if you're willing to try to store up treasures in heaven, if you're willing to truly change your heart from being here to being on heaven, then you're going to be able to follow me. So essentially, Jesus is saying, you can't truly follow me. You can't truly have what I'm offering if you're still making things here your treasure. You have to shift what you think your treasure is to build to follow me. Actually follow me. And he says it'll be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. He doesn't say it's flat out impossible. He doesn't say that some multimillionaire who is just really successful in business can't be dedicated to God and following God. But he says it's going to be really hard for them to do it, to enter the kingdom of heaven, because they still have so much other stuff to be attached to. He's saying, if you're attached to all this other stuff, basically, you're going to have a really hard time experiencing me, because your mind isn't going to be on me. There's all sorts of studies and stuff, I couldn't reference all of them, about these people who get crazy rich randomly, like just winning lottery and stuff like that, and their depression goes way up. Because all of a sudden they have all these things initially there's all that joy of winning money and stuff like that, but then all of a sudden you have all these possessions and you're concerned about losing things. So that's what Jesus is he's not saying those words, but he's kind of painting that picture of you can't treasure these things and treasure me. He's just continuing that thought. He's challenging this man where his heart is. Now, we're not reading all these passages. In this conversation with this rich young man, it gets followed up with Peter, I think it's Peter, opening his mouth and going, hey, look, we've given up everything and we're following you. Kind of like, give us little thumbs up, Jesus. Come on, give us a thumbs up. And Jesus continues with that thought of basically, he doesn't say, no, you haven't. He says, yes. And anyone who gives up things for my name's sake and will follow me and suffer in the end time, at the end, will get their reward. Jesus says that kind of stuff a lot. He never says, you're not going to find passages where Jesus says, if you give $10 to your church today, next week Jesus is going to give you $100. There's never earthly buying your grace and your blessings on earth. Jesus does talk about rewards continually. Paul talks about it, build and the builder has his reward, but it's all in heaven. Because if we're building and our heart's dedicated to Jesus, our treasures that we're building are in heaven. What those treasures look like, I don't know. If I give $100,000 to the church in my life, or $200,000-$300,000 through my tithing and giving, I don't know if I'm going to go to get to heaven and have a palace because earthly, money to money. I don't picture God being that way. But it does paint a picture that if I'm being faithful and my treasure is Jesus, and I'm treating my earthly possessions as they're not the treasure, there's rewards in heaven. There are rewards in heaven. Build up treasures in your heaven. We're in Matthew 6. You will have treasures in heaven is in this Matthew 19 passage. Jesus is putting those in there regularly. We're going to keep going. Some Jesus and money topics here. So we're going to jump to Mark chapter 12 now. Mark chapter 12, 41 through 44. And this is a really, really telling little passage, I think. It takes a lot of, I think, pondering to really get down deep into it. So here it goes. He, being Jesus, this is when he's in the temple in Jerusalem, sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called the disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." All she had to live on. So, when it comes to money, there are some things I don't know exactly. I didn't read this because I'm hoping that every one of you will leave here and sell your cars and sell your houses and come and give us all the money that you possessed and all be poor. I'm not reading that because of that type of a mindset. I've read this passage because there's some really interesting things here. The first one being, I'm going to try to paint a little picture. Huge temple. The temple in Jerusalem at this time is huge. Think super mega church. The biggest structure there pretty much is in all of Israel at the time for ground space. It's a huge, huge thing. Jesus goes to right where the treasury is, or basically where you bring your wealth, your money to give to the temple, to give your monetary offerings, your tithing, your gift. And he sits down and watches people give it in. It's an interesting scenario. Think now if we did something like that. Like instead of an offering box, an online tithing thing, we put this open kind of money thing here. And I sat down in a chair right here and watched every person one by one come by and put their offering in. Kind of changes a little bit of a picture, an image there. Now, I don't want to do that. But to some extent, it would maybe add some accountability. I don't know, not saying accountability in that way. But the thing is that I'm putting is Jesus is watching. Who knows? The temple is crazy busy. There could be hundreds, there could be thousands, there could have been 10 people. I don't know, going through, watching these people put money in. It doesn't say he's teaching, he's just sitting there. I don't know if it's 10 feet, 100 feet, but he can clearly see what people are doing. He's just watching people put money in. Which kind of jumps out the first thing that I wanted to point out is Jesus can see what we're doing with our treasures. I can't see your bank account. I don't know your hourly wages. I don't know that. Jesus and God do. You're not sneaking something by